is E&P Reports, a vodcast from editor and publisher. Since 1884, the authoritative voice of news publishing. And this episode sponsored by IQ Audience Plus by Town News. Consumer revenue has never been more important. Digital leaders at media organizations worldwide understand the need to accelerate its growth now. Plus, traditional one-size-fits-all paywalls aren't the answer. They're blunt instruments that treat all visitors the same way. IQ Audience Plus is a smart, dynamic metering solution that empowers media companies to maximize revenue by identifying key audiences, seeding engagement, and growing membership and subscriptions. Supercharge your consumer revenue, grow engagement, and bolster your advertising income now with IQ Audience Plus. Visit townnews.com EP today to learn more. And hi and welcome. I'm Mike Blinder, publisher of E&P Magazine. Quick housekeeping. Listening to us on your favorite audio podcast platform, please follow us. Watching us on our YouTube channel, smash the subscribe button below the screen. Bang the bell to the right. You'll get an update each and every time we upload a new episode of E&P Reports. I have got a pretty distinguished panel here. Some regulars that are been joining me lately, including Gretchen Peck. Hey, Gretchen, you're coming to us from a beautiful background there.
Good morning.
Where are you?
We're in Vermont.
There you go. Nothing like Vermont, especially with Christmas movies. Gretchen's a contributing editor here at Editor and Publisher Magazine. An old friend of E&P, of course, is Roxanne Cooper, publisher at Raw Story. Roxanne, you're on the West Coast today. You're in the Bay Area, correct?
Yep.
Working with Gretchen at Raw Story is Jordan Green. Jordan, you're a friend of E&P. We've had you in a previous broadcast. You're kind of like the investigative journalist at Raw Story that really dives into the extremism, hate crimes, and what have you. Would that be a good way to describe your work, Jordan?
Yeah, thank you. Great to be back with you.
Excellent. And of course, I'm honored, really honored to have Chris Jones here. Chris, you're with Report for America. Oh, you're a fellow with Report for America, or you're a fellow with 100 Days in Appalachia, correct? And and your background is amazing, sir. You were deployed in Afghanistan as a Marine?
Many moons ago. And then I was in the Marines from 2010 to 2014. And then after I got out of the Marines, I just started working as a photojournalist. And I've been working as a photojournalist and investigative reporter since 2014. And really only covered, the war in Afghanistan, and then more and more was covering extremism and that sort of thing in the United States.
And I have to mention this, your work has been honored. This year, you got the National Edward Murrow Award for Hard News. Congratulations, sir. We're honored.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, 100 Days won that. It was, it's funny, definitely not, we're not a newsroom that's like really looking for awards. And I think we all found out about it. I don't think any of us realized that we'd submitted for it. So it was kind of nice to get an award that we weren't even really looking to, we weren't even waiting for the announcement.
It's so funny. We give away we don't give away. We honor the industry with Epi Awards every year. Some very, very amazing journalists win this.
See, that's the one that's the one we wanted and didn't get it, but I guess we'll take a Murrow.
I was just going to say that you'd be surprised how many times we send an email to a winner and goes, I didn't know we entered, because their boss did it. Or something. Happens all that, especially CNN has a full-time just awards person. You know what I mean? That just submits everything. But let's get down to brass tacks. We decided at E&P, like many publications did in January, to look at 1 year past the insurrection of January 6th. I use that term insurrection, not and let me be very clear. I'm using that term because that's exactly what it was as far as E&P is concerned. That is the definition of the attack on the Capitol building. But we wanted to craft an article, and Gretchen, you did an amazing job with this with our cover story in January, that was geared towards the real E&P reader, which is the news publisher. In other words, E&P's audience, just so everyone knows, at least we target and we verify that online through our digital, tagging and everything, is someone who claims they're a decision maker, a manager in the news publishing industry, crafting journalistic content, finding an audience for it, and monetizing it. Gretchen, give us the background on how you picked who you interviewed for this great cover story. That is basically focused on how to report on hate speech and the extremism in today's world.
Well, I think it was born really out of January 6th. As I was talking to Jordan and Chris earlier, I think a lot of Americans were sort of caught off guard by what happened that day. They may have known, a little bit about militias in the Michigan forest, but suddenly we had these groups, these extremist groups, sort of at the forefront of national dialogue and, in fact, in the nation's capital. And I kind of felt, and Robin, our VP of content, felt that we had missed the story as the US press. We haven't been focused on it at a local level where, some of these organizations, militias, extremist groups, and so forth, organize, communicate, prepare, plan, and execute on some of these national events that we are aware of. So we wanted to go and look for reporters who are covering these groups at the ground level every day, day in, day out. And what we found there were very few of them.
let me bring in Roxanne. Roxanne, you are the publisher and editor of Raw Story, defined as, there's no question that you lean very far to the left in your reporting, but you're kind of a watchdog. How would you define?
No, we're not the Noam Chomsky news, so we're not that far left.
Okay, but define your lane, Roxanne. What is Raw Story quickly, and why is this issue near and dear to you?
Well, as we were saying earlier, I guess E&P and some other places were caught by surprise on January 6th last year, and we weren't caught by surprise.
Okay.
Because a focus of our reporting has been extremism for a while. And in fact, when I was reading your story, your cover story the other day, and it's really about, a lot of the story is about safety, like
right.
How to be safe in covering this kind of environment, which I think is great content for your audience. And what I thought of immediately when I read it was, we had a reporter several years ago who was caught a mile down the road in Oregon when Lavoy Finicum was shot and killed outside of the Oregon Bird Reserve. And so that's a story we covered on the ground. We actually got onto the compound, and we're not an Oregon outlet, we're a national outlet. And so if you want to go back to your original question, if you want to know what Raw Story is about, we're sort of pretty good at figuring out where these stories are before they happen. I mean, we have been very good at covering extremism for at least the last decade. So,
well, it's okay. Let's dive into that. I was reading some of the quotes from Chris in the story. Chris, when you were chatting with Gretchen, one of the things you talked about was how you will identify yourself when you are covered. Doesn't this scare the hell out of you, Chris? I mean, what was you were at an event and you made it very clear to these right-wing extremists at the event that you were here covering it for America and you were going to tell the story?
I think, it's not one of, I've been doing this for a while, and I think I mentioned in the article, covering Afghanistan and having to figure out how to sit down with the Taliban makes sitting down with, domestic extremists who are a few degrees away from that level of severity, just makes that a little easier. But I think the other thing too is like, it's a really complex sort of beat or concept to cover, right? And I think that, somebody can be heavily armed and highly antagonistic towards the U.S. government and American society, but also be, an individual with a personality and, qualities that you can identify with one-on-one, right? Like they're scary, but at the same time, a lot of these people are really just looking, especially when they see a journalist, you're still an opportunity for them to like be heard. And And so all these moments are scary, especially when you are, surrounded by them. It's not that scary, because I still think that ultimately being a journalist and walking into a situation like that and sort of telling everybody present, like, hey, I'm a journalist, everything in front of me is on the record. While it can be threatening to a lot of people, there's still I wouldn't call it a respect for journalism or journalists at all, but there's still a little bit of an awareness that, you're if what they're doing, if they really believe in it, right, and they're not ashamed to sort of let everybody see it.
Let's stay with you. Let's stay with you on that, because you did cover the January 6th insurrection. You were embedded.
I did.
You were there.
Yes, very, very present.
in the middle of the crowd.
Mm-hmm.
And then you spent a lot of time covering this story, and then you went back, I'm sure, to whatever office, home, or wherever you were, and you turned on the TV and watched the cable news coverage regurgitate the story over and over again. What was your perspective versus that perspective? Can I first get into that? What did you see or learn or uncover that you don't think America even found out from the national coverage?
So it's interesting, like myself and maybe 2 or 3 other photojournalists that we're colleagues, and we all kind of stuck together through most of the day. We really didn't watch a lot of the news coverage because we were sort of like, it's a bit like watching news coverage of a firefight after you're in it. You're like, well, I was there, I know what happened. But definitely in the weeks and months afterwards, started seeing more and more of it. Actually, I got a bunch of text messages towards the end of the day because I walked through a CNN live shot of the Capitol, and all of a sudden all my cousins and, aunts and uncles were blowing up my phone like, oh my God, are you okay? And I was like, what? But, it was interesting, right? I think especially with cable news coverage, where a lot of these shots, they're usually static, right? They're usually large crowd shots. Everybody knows those really iconic shots of January 6th, where that you see the whole Capitol, you can see the cap on top, and it just seems like a huge sea of red and white and blue with a little bit of tear gas poking out, right? And it looks almost calm, and it those are the shots that you see when certain individuals who are there try to say, no, it wasn't that bad, because it didn't look that bad. But it was, I've told a couple of people that was like the worst day of my life, and I've had a lot of bad days. The level of violence, I think, it definitely caught a lot of the participants themselves, a lot of the insurrectionists by surprise, because they've been talking themselves up for so long about this, and all of a sudden they were doing it, right? And there was a lot of violence, really, like one-on-one. I mean, the way that they were attacking law enforcement, the way they would attack members of the press, right? The way they moved through the building, actively seeking out elected officials, not to, voice their displeasure, but to do real harm. That level of vehemence really doesn't seem to have stayed in the focus, or was really never part of the focus, I feel like, from that level of coverage. The other thing too is there was a lot, I saw multiple firearms on people in the crowd, right?
Really?
And it was the sort of thing where, there was also somebody who placed 2 explosive devices at the RNC and DNC, and to date, federal law enforcement doesn't, they don't even have a suspect for it, right? There was a lot of layers to the capacity for violence that was there that day, that I think by and large, as a whole, we've kind of agreed to sort of, well, we're not gonna focus on that. We don't really want to scare ourselves too much with the seriousness of what could have been.
If I could jump in real quick,
sure, Jordan.
On the firearms issue, which has been an issue of contention. Apologists have said the insurrectionists were not armed. Last month, or this past month, the first January 6th defendant was indicted, who carried a loaded firearm, Mark Mazza from Indiana, at the Capitol. And it was loaded with hollow point bullets, which are designed to explode on impact. And
let's go back to our audience. Most of the people, of the thousands listening to this now, are in charge of news operations. Some of them, in my humble opinion, are saying, look, national news is covering this story. It's fine. I'd rather not make waves in my community because some of my advertisers, you know what I mean? Enough of this crap. I've had it. I'm just going to try to, cover the church suppers and the school board and the local high school. I loved your quote in our cover story, Chris, where you said, treat this like a public safety issue. I mean, can you circle back to that? Talk to that publisher right now, one-on-one.
For sure.
And say, why the heck should you motivate your newsroom to cover this as local? Because that maybe would solve the problem.
So I think, a real quick thing to point out, right, for the publisher's perspective is that if you're not going to cover this, like you said, other people are. Well, they're not doing, if your audience can't come to you for information about this, if they can't trust you, especially if you are that trusted outlet for them, maybe you have that local connection or, you're in that vertical where, you are people's go-to source of information about very complex topics. If you're making the choice not to cover this, they're going to go somewhere else for it. And they're not necessarily going to just go to CNN, right? They're going to go to the rest of the internet to be informed on this, right? And if your job, right, if kind of the point of journalism, if that makes it anything different from, an op-ed page, right? If your job is that, hey, we're here, ostensibly all of us are here to do reporting that helps make a more informed body politic out of America, right?
Right.
This is a public safety issue, number one, because at the core of what we're talking about is Americans bringing firearms and the willingness, capacity, and ability to inflict violence over their political goals. That's happening in America right now. That alone, right? If you bring a gun into a public street, I live in West by God, Virginia, right? People open carry here all the time, whatever. Okay. Not a news story. But the second you bring your gun to politics, right? Where you're willing to bring the threat of, a firearm to your neighbors because you guys disagree over what's going on in Charleston or what's going on in Washington, D.C. That is a very, very, very serious safety issue on a public level, right?
But you don't even have to bring the gun. The far right can get on the phone and just threaten and leave voicemails
for sure
to someone who's in charge of collecting ballots in a small town.
I mean, they can go beyond that, right? They can find the address, the home address of somebody who organized a small Black Lives Matter protest in a rural community, and they can drive by their house every day and say, we know where you live. They can get that person fired, right? So for exactly what you're talking about, the public safety aspect. Also, I think the reason I really encourage, especially at the publisher and editorial level, where there is, like you pointed out, so much fear of, oh no, we might piss off our advertisers, right? If you center your reporting as public safety, I think you really neutralize a lot of, oh, you're being too political by even talking about this, right? Because it's not a partisan take to say, hey, you are threatening other people over your politics, right? You are implying a willingness to do violence over political disagreement, right? If you center your reporting there, I think it goes really far to, number one, really reframe this issue in a way where everybody can understand where you're coming from and why you keep talking about it. And two, it's only going to prove as this develops that you're a trustworthy source for anybody involved, right? Both sides of the political divide can come to you and say, okay, I am number one concerned about, public safety. And if that's where your reporting centered from, I think it, in the experience we've had, at least in West Virginia, where anybody, if you walk up to anyone and say, hi, I'm a journalist, get ready to be grilled and, called a coastal liberal elite, right? People are more than willing to engage with our reporting and trust us because we say, oh, we're covering this because it's a public safety issue. I want to make sure you and your family are safe every day, no matter what you do. I think it's interesting too about, looking back at root cause. And this is something, here at 100 Days, we're actually doing a workshop. And as far as we know, I think we're the only ones doing it, but we're setting up a workshop that's explicitly pointed at local newsrooms and regional newsrooms on covering extremism. And one of the big things I realized in talking to a lot of folks that, I worked really closely with over the last 2 years to cover stuff on the local level is that there really is not, within the industry, right? There's not a baseline understanding of the historical trajectory of what we're dealing with, right? You went back to Charlottesville and realizing that, if you can't connect the dots from, Ruby Ridge to Waco, Texas, to Oklahoma City, to, Charlottesville to January 6th, right? If you can't go that far back, if you can't go back to the 80s with the KKK in North Carolina and attacking Vietnamese boat refugees in Texas. Big shout out to Kathleen Bellu's Bring the War Home book, which is a must read for anyone on this topic. Anyways, if you don't have that level understanding, covering this is, number one, very difficult, and number two, it's dangerous almost in the sense that you can really do more platforming than reporting because you don't understand what the people you're talking to are trying to use you to amplify, right?
Chris,
and so I would just think to address that, I think there's a real need within the industry to sort of collectively decide, like, okay, what is the baseline understanding that you have to have before you jump into this topic, right? And all of us kind of talking within the industry, especially at that editorial level, the editors, right? If I can't have an intelligent conversation with an editor about what this issue really is, you're not going to understand why I'm pitching you a story about some Proud Boy guy who, as far as you can tell, is just putting stickers around, right? If the editors don't understand why that is a scary thing to see in a small town, you know what I mean? Because so much of the onus, I think, on why did we miss this gets put on reporters who've been screaming about this stuff for years. And you guys made the mistake of bringing me on to talk to editors and publishers. And as a lifelong, reporter and a freelancer, I do think that it would be a lot more beneficial across the industry if editors who ever have to deal with this topic were willing to spend a weekend or two reading up on it, right?
Getting there you
really
go.
informed.
Oh, so one of the things you said, Chris, up front, which I loved, is you look them dead in the eye. When I say them, I'm not being judgmental. I'm saying an extremist, and say to them, I'm here to tell the story. You don't, you don't judge them. You give them almost a sense of empathy. I mean, a sense of...
for sure. I mean, before, and this is kind of was mentioned before, right? Before, no one's born a terrorist, right? You become a terrorist based on your actions, right? And speaking of that as well, right? I mean, everybody, all of these people that we're now calling extremists started out pretty much on the same page. We're all born in the United States of America, ostensibly. We have a lot more in common than we have different, right? And a lot of times the things that motivate individuals to go down this path, of being, extremism, from what I've seen and what I've reported and what I've experienced, a lot of it's a perversion of something that's not necessarily bad. A lot of people, especially in the militia space, they really start out as, I'm uneasy, I'm really concerned about where the country as a whole, the trajectory as I understand it, is headed, and I want to do something about it, right? That right there, a person who's in that moment, that's not inherently a dangerous person. That's somebody who wants to be proactive about the direction their country's going in. What happens is the people who get to those people first, right, through social media, through certain types of public media, right? Whoever grabs that willingness to act and says, hey, I agree, I'm going to strap a narrative to your concern, and I think you should go get a gun, right? That intersection is really the problem point, I think.
But moreover, we should not be judgmental of our fellow man. We should offer them empathy and listen.
And not just listen, but listen to, everything. All of this comes down, right, to real and perceived grievances. And I think a lot of times we wash over their grievances as all being perceived, right? Oh, this is all conspiracy or fake news, right?
Right, exactly.
But at the end of the day, right, I always clip, right? There's two kinds of people in America. There's people, and it all comes down to how you remember 2008, right? I think there really isn't enough attention paid to how much of what we're seeing right now in the sort of short term is in response to the way that, like, the economic situation in America has changed, right? You can really strap a lot of the increase in political violence, historically, to things like wealth gaps, right? Things like people who don't see the government in their literal day-to-day life. They don't see the government helping them, right? And there are a lot of people who are really invested in convincing them that the government won't help them going forward, right? And I find a lot of times that I end up having far longer conversations with people who are really, really, really down the rabbit hole, who are leading their own militias, right? Who are actively making the situation worse. When you sit down and you're just like, hey, what's your deal? What's your story? Who are you? Where'd you come from? I'm here to talk to me for an hour. I spend a lot more time talking about problems and frustrations that are really a lot more universal, that are a lot more familiar than they do talking about, the new world order conspiracy stuff. So I just find that, when I went to go do a story leading up to November 8th, right? And I was talking to a guy who was organizing Trump parades, right? This was not a guy who was convinced that there was going to be some, mass purge of liberals by Trump, and he was going to, blah, 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 blah. This guy was really frustrated over the fact that a lot of the things promised, by the federal government. I mean, there's a lot of genuine frustration in West Virginia with the federal government for a lot of genuine reasons, right? That frustration was now strapped onto the MAGA experience, right? Suddenly he had a way where he could be proactive towards the things that he felt powerless against. And we hear this a lot, right? What I'm saying isn't necessarily new. It's not a narrative that, editors.
No, we hear this everywhere.
Exactly. But it's important, I think, to remind ourselves that, like, we hear it a lot because it's true, and maybe reframing how we approach that aspect of it, will be productive in terms of doing more reporting that's actually going to change minds. So it's working so far.
Take one quick observation. When I was talking to you guys for the story, and also Ali Breland at Mother Jones and Will Summer at the Daily Beast, a common thread that came up in all of our conversations was, really focus on the victims here. There are victims that, of course, are terrorized by some of these organizations. There are victims within their own community. Chris, you spoke very briefly when we spoke about, being concerned about victims in the community, within their own community. So empathy was really, a running theme as we spoke about this kind of coverage. And I just wanted to point that out.
I think that's marvelous. I guess if I could put some words out here about Chris. Chris, first of all, you've been to Afghanistan. So you when you go into these environments, you've had a little bit more, how should I say, you've been beaten up a little bit. So it doesn't scare you as much, I assume. But that you also have the ability to have empathy for the fellow human being you're interviewing without prejudging them.
Yeah.
And that comes across in your body language during the interview process. It's not just, dictating it in a training session in a newsroom. You're feeling empathy for your fellow man, which maybe every newsroom needs to do a little bit more of. Am I saying that right, Chris?
I think, yes. And I want to be upfront too, right? I'm a 6 foot tall white guy with a beard who spent a lot of time around combat zones, right? My ability to go into these spaces and be around these groups is different from a lot of other reporters. And, I've had people sort of ask me like, oh, does that mean like only a certain type of person can cover the far right? And I don't think that's the case at all. I don't think that the way I approach this is universal and necessarily prescriptive, but really to go back, to what you just said, right? Covering this is not just looking at the people who are threatening violence. If covering the far right directly is not an option, right, or is uncomfortable as a newsroom, then really focusing that reporting on the people who are victimized, not just today, right, not just right now, but showing people in your audience and your readership how no, this goes back a long time. There are lots of people who have been victimized by these types of groups for a long, long time, and they're still here, right? And listening to them, right? You talk about being empathetic. When I talk to, a Black Lives Matter organizer whose mother was an organizer in the 1960s for the civil rights movement, right? Being just as aggressively empathetic towards, hey, I have way less in common with your experience than I do somebody in a militia, right? Point blank. I can understand that I don't know what your lived experience is like, but I am here to get as much of what you think you have to say for your community, right, in front of people, and I want to make sure I'm doing that story right, it's empathy, but I think it's recognizing, what kind of empathy and really making that empathy, I don't want to use productive, right, but being willing to change what empathy means to you in the moment as you're reporting, so that you're getting the best kind of journalism out there, depending on who you're talking to. Does that make any sense?
If I could jump in, I mean, I think this is really tricky. It's not cut and dry. I do land where I land, I think, is that we need to preserve the larger part of our empathy for the victims and not the perpetrators. I mean, in the kind of example that comes to mind for me is I reported on a Proud Boy in North Carolina who harassed a anti-fascist female activist whose brother was killed in a train accident. And, he online has called her an Antifa whore and talked about whether she should be dropped out of an airplane. Like, people are saying really awful things. So I'm not gonna, I'm not comfortable kind of broing it up with that guy, because I don't want to give any comfort to somebody who is actively hurting people. But in terms of empathy for people who are immersed in violent conspiracy theories and extremist activity, yeah, I think there's a common denominator. We do have a common humanity with them, and I was just an example of that I was thinking of is I've talked to young men who wanted to go, who weren't cut out for the U.S. military, but they wanted to go fight in Ukraine because they're attracted to violence. And I thought there's no way I can have anything in common with these guys, but in fact we do. We're all looking for purpose. We're looking for a sense of excitement, and it turns out that we have a lot to talk about, and they appreciate that I'm interested in their world, and that's kind of a foundation, a starting point for a rapport, a sourcing and reporting relationship.
Well, let's leave it on that note, because I agree with you, Jordan, on many, many levels. But I also think one of the best ways to diffuse this disinformation is to make everyone more comfortable coming to a media outlet that doesn't come across as condescending. Does that, or judgmental?
And I think to really agree with Jordan, right? The point of being empathetic towards extremists is not to make sure their feelings aren't hurt, right? The point, I'll be honest with you, it's a bit mercenary, not in a I'm here to make them look bad, right? But it's about accountability. And if I have to sit down with you and be friendly and open with you, for you to talk truthfully about what it is you do and what your motivations are, the point of that conversation isn't for me to go back to my newsroom and write an article where you're like, you know what, that felt good. He didn't say any mean things. It's so that when I go write my article and I'm saying, this is what this person said, right? And I'm going to hold that word accountable, and I'm going to point out if it's violent, right? I'm going to point out if what they're saying is dangerous, right?
Of course.
And then they're willing, the empathy has to have a point. It's not empathy for empathy's sake. It's so you can hold people accountable, which I think is a big part of, what Jordan was pressing to, right? You don't just want to make everybody happy. You want to make sure you're effective. Let's
leave it at that. If someone wants to follow you more, Chris, with 100 Days in Appalachia, do they go to the Reporter for America? Where will they find more of your content, sir?
Yeah, it'll be on 100daysinAppalachia.com, okay. And then as well as Report for America and the GroundTruth Project. And yeah, that's otherwise, I'm out in West Virginia. Drop me a line if you enter our neck of the woods, I guess. I'm not super online.
Roxanne, Jordan is not the only reporter at Raw Story. We know that for a fact. Where will they follow his journalism and the rest of your team?
You can see Jordan's reports at rawstory.com. I'm sure Jordan has a Twitter feed where he's pushing out his own stories. People want to follow his Twitter feed. And then we're at rawstory.com.
Excellent. Gretchen, any final thoughts on how we'll be following this up in the months to come?
Well, I just want to say I'm so grateful for all of your work. I've learned so much from it, and I know other reporters really follow you all. Just be safe out there. Have a happy and healthy new year, and we'll be in touch.
Ditto. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you.